Chapter 3. I saw them as we approached the short stretch that lay between the railroad tracks and the Golden Day. At first I failed to recognize them. They straggled down the highway in a loose body, blocking the way from the white line to the frazzled weeds that bordered the sun-heated concrete slab. I cursed them silently. They were blocking the road and Mr. Norton was gasping for breath. Ahead of the radiator's gleaming curve they looked like a chain gang on its way to make a road. But a chain gang marches single file and I saw no guards on horseback. As I drew nearer I recognized the loose gray shirts and pants worn by the veterans. Damn. They were heading for the Golden Day. A little stimulant, I heard behind me. In a few minutes, sir. Up ahead I saw the one who thought he was a drum major strutting in front, giving orders as he moved energetically in long, hip-swinging strides, a cane held above his head, rising and falling as though in time to music. I slowed the car as I saw him turn to face the men, his cane held at chest level as he shortened the pace. The men continued to ignore him, walking along in a mass, some talking in groups and others talking and gesticulating to themselves. Suddenly, the drum major saw the car and shook his cane baton at me. I blew the horn, seeing the men move over to the side as I nosed the car slowly forward. He held his ground, his legs braced, hands on hips, and to keep from hitting him I slammed on the brakes. The drum major rushed past the men toward the car, and I heard the cane bang down upon the hood as he rushed toward me. "Who the hell you think you are, running down the army? Give the countersign. Who's in command of this outfit? You trucking bastards was always too big for your britches. Countersign me." "This is General Pershing's car, sir," I said, remembering hearing that he responded to the name of his wartime commander-in-chief. Suddenly the wild look changed in his eyes and he stepped back and saluted with stiff precision. Then looking suspiciously into the back seat, he barked, "Where's the general?" "There," I said, turning and seeing Mr. Norton raising himself, weak and wide-faced, from the seat. "What is it? Why have we stopped?" "The sergeant stopped us, sir." "Sergeant? What sergeant?" He sat up. "Is that you, General?" the vet said, saluting. "I didn't know you were inspecting the front lines today." "I'm very sorry, sir." "What?" Mr. Norton said. "The general's in a hurry," I said quickly. "Sure is," the vet said. "He's got a lot to see. Discipline is bad. Artillery's shot to hell." Then he called to the men walking up the road, "Get the hell out of the general's road. General Pershing's coming through. Make way for General Pershing." He stepped aside and I shot the car across the line to avoid the men and stayed there on the wrong side as I headed for the Golden Day. "Who was that man?" Mr. Norton gasped from the back seat. "A former soldier, sir." "A vet?" "They're all vets," a little shell-shocked. "But where is the attendant?" "I don't see one, sir." "They're harmless though." "Nevertheless, they should have an attendant." I had to get him there and away before they arrived. This was their day to visit the girls, and the Golden Day would be pretty rowdy. I wondered where the rest of them were. There should have been about 50. Well, I would rush in and get the whiskey and leave. What was wrong with Mr. Norton anyway? Why should he get that upset over Trueblood? I had felt ashamed and several times I had wanted to laugh, but it had made him sick. Maybe he needed a doctor. Hell, he didn't ask for any doctor. Damn that bastard Trueblood. I would run in, get a pint, and run out again, I thought. Then he wouldn't see the Golden Day. I seldom went there myself except with some of the fellows when word got out that a new bunch of girls had arrived from New Orleans. The school had tried to make the Golden Day respectable, but the local white folks had a hand in it somehow and they got nowhere. The best the school could do was to make it hot for any student caught going there. He lay like a man asleep as I left the car and ran into the Golden Day. I wanted to ask him for money but decided to use my own. At the door I paused. The place was already full, jammed with vets in loose gray shirts and trousers and women in short, tight-fitting, stiffly starched gingham aprons. The stale beer smell struck like a club through the noise of voices and the jukebox. Just as I got inside the door, a stolid-faced man gripped me by the arm and looked stonily into my eyes. "It will occur at 5:30, he said, looking straight through me. "What?" "The great all-embracing, absolute armistice, the end of the world," he said. Before I could answer, a small plump woman smiled into my face and pulled him away. "It's your turn, Doc," she said. "Don't let it happen till after me and you done been upstairs. How come I always have to come get you?" "No, it is true," he said. "They wirelessed me from Paris this morning." "Then, baby, me and you better hurry. There's lots of money I got to make in here before that thing happens. You hold it back a while, will you?" She winked at me as she pulled him through the crowd toward the stairs. I elbowed my way nervously toward the bar. Many of the men had been doctors, lawyers, teachers, civil service workers. There were several cooks, a preacher, a politician, and an artist. One very nutty one had been a psychiatrist. Whenever I saw them I felt uncomfortable. They were supposed to be members of the professions toward which at various times I vaguely aspired myself, and even though they never seemed to see me I could never believe that they were really patients. Sometimes it appeared as though they played some vast and complicated game with me and the rest of the school folk, a game whose goal was a laughter and whose rules and subtleties I could never grasp. Two men stood directly in front of me, one speaking with intense earnestness. And Johnson hit Jeffers at an angle of 45 degrees from his lower left lateral incisor, producing an instantaneous blocking of his entire thalamic rind, frosting it over like the freezing unit of a refrigerator, thus shattering his autonomous nervous system and rocking the big bricklaying cream puff with extreme hyperspasmic muscular tremors which dropped him dead on the extreme tip of his coccyx, which, in turn, produced a sharp traumatic reaction in his sphincter nerve and muscle, and then, my dear colleague, they swept him up, sprinkled him with quicklime and rolled him away in a barrow. Naturally, there was no other therapy possible. "Excuse me," I said, pushing past. Big Hallie was behind the bar, his dark skin showing through his sweat-wet shirt. "Whatcha saying, schoolboy?" "I want a double whiskey, Hallie. Put it in something deep so I can get it out of here without spilling it. It's for somebody outside." His mouth shot out. "Hell, nah." "Why?" I asked, surprised at the anger in his thyroid eyes. "You still up at the school, ain't you?" "Sure. Well, those bastards is trying to close me up again, that's why. You can drink till you blue in the face in here, but I wouldn't sell you enough to spit through your teeth to take outside. But I've got a sick man out in the car." "What car?" "You never had no car." "The white man's car. I'm driving for him." "Ain't you in school?" "He's from the school." "Well, who's sick?" "He is." "He too good to come in?" "Tell him we don't Jim Crow nobody." "But he's sick. He can die." "He's important, Hallie, a trustee. He's rich and sick, and if anything happens to him, they'll have me packed and on my way home." "Can't help it, schoolboy. Bring him inside and he can buy enough to swim in. He can drink out of my own private bottle." He sliced the white heads off a couple of beers with an ivory paddle and passed them up the bar. I felt sick inside. Mr. Norton wouldn't want to come in here. He was too sick. And besides, I didn't want him to see the patients and the girls. Things were getting wilder as I made my way out. Supercargo, the white uniformed attendant who usually kept the men quiet, was nowhere to be seen. I didn't like it, for when he was upstairs they had absolutely no inhibitions. I made my way out to the car. What could I tell Mr. Norton? He was lying very still when I opened the door. "Mr. Norton, sir. They refused to sell me whiskey to bring out." He lay very still. "Mr. Norton." He lay like a figure of chalk. I shook him gently, feeling dread within me. He barely breathed. I shook him violently, seeing his head wobble grotesquely. His lips parted, bluish, revealing a row of long, slender, amazingly animal-like teeth. "Sir." In a panic I ran back into the golden day, bursting through the noise as through an invisible wall. "Hallie. "Help me, he's dying." I tried to get through, but no one seemed to have heard me. I was blocked on both sides. They were jammed together. "Hallie." Two patients turned and looked me in the face, their eyes 2 inches from my nose. "What is wrong with this gentleman, Sylvester?" the tall one said. "A man's dying outside," I said. "Someone is always dying," the other one said. "Yes, and it's good to die beneath God's great tent of sky. He's got to have some whiskey." "Oh, that's different," one of them said, and they began pushing a path to the bar. "A last bright drink to keep the anguish down." "Step aside, please." "Schoolboy, you back already?" Hallie said. "Give me some whiskey. He's dying." "I done told you, schoolboy, you better bring him in here. He can die, but I still got to pay my bills. Please, they'll put me in jail." "You going to college? Figure it out," he said. "You'd better bring the gentleman inside," the one called Sylvester said. "Come, let us assist you." We fought our way out of the crowd. He was just as I left him. "Look, Sylvester, it's Thomas Jefferson." I was just about to say, "I've long wanted to discourse with him." I looked at them speechlessly. They were both crazy. Or were they joking? "Give me a hand," I said. "Gladly." I shook him. "Mr. Norton." "We'd better hurry if he's to enjoy his drink," one of them said thoughtfully. We picked him up. He swung between us like a sack of old clothes. "Hurry." As we carried him toward the Golden Day, one of the men stopped suddenly and Mr. Norton's head hung down, his white hair dragging in the dust. "Gentlemen, this man is my grandfather." "But he's white, his name's Norton." "I should know my own grandfather. He's Thomas Jefferson and I'm his grandson, on the field nigger side," the tall man said. "Sylvester, I do believe that you're right." "I certainly do," he said, staring at Mr. Norton. "Look at those features. Exactly like yours, from the identical mold. Are you sure he didn't spit you upon the earth, fully clothed?" "No, no, that was my father," the man said earnestly. And he began to curse his father violently as we moved for the door. Hallie was there waiting. Somehow he'd gotten the crowd to quiet down and a space was cleared in the center of the room. The men came close to look at Mr. Norton. "Somebody bring a chair." "Yeah, let Mr. Eddie sit down." "That ain't no Mr. Eddie, man, that's John D. Rockefeller," someone said. "Here's a chair for the Messiah." "Stand back y'all," Hallie ordered. "Give him some room." Burnside, who had been a doctor, rushed forward and felt for Mr. Norton's pulse. "It's solid. This man has a solid pulse. Instead of beating, it vibrates. That's very unusual." "Very." Someone pulled him away. Hallie reappeared with a bottle and a glass. "Here, some of y'all tilt his head back." And before I could move, a short, pock-marked man appeared and took Mr. Norton's head between his hands, tilting it at arm's length and then, pinching the chin gently like a barber about to apply a razor, gave a sharp, swift movement. Pow! Mr. Norton's head jerked like a jabbed punching bag. 5 pale red lines bloomed on the white cheek, glowing like fire beneath translucent stone. I could not believe my eyes. I wanted to run. A woman tittered. I saw several men rush for the door. "Cut it out, you damn fool." "A case of hysteria," the pock-marked man said quietly. "Get the hell out of the way," Hallie said. "Somebody get that stool pigeon attendant from upstairs. Get him down here, quick." "A mere mild case of hysteria," the pock-marked man said as they pushed him away. "Hurry with the drink, Hallie." "Schoolboy, you hold the glass. This here's brandy I been saving for myself." Someone whispered tonelessly into my ear, "You see, I told you that it would occur at 5:30. Already the creator has come." It was the stolid-faced man. I saw Hallie tilt the bottle and the oily amber of brandy sloshing into the glass. Then tilting Mr. Norton's head back, I put the glass to his lips and poured. A fine brown stream ran from the corner of his mouth, down his delicate chin. The room was suddenly quiet. I felt a slight movement against my hand, like a child's breast when it whimpers at the end of a spell of crying. The fine-veined eyelids flickered. He coughed. I saw a slow red flush creep, then spurt, up his neck, spreading over his face. Hold it under his nose, schoolboy. Let him smell it. I waved the glass beneath Mr. Norton's nose. He opened his pale blue eyes. They seemed watery now in the red flush that bathed his face. He tried to sit up, his right hand fluttering to his chin. His eyes widened, moved quickly from face to face. Then coming to mine, the moist eyes focused with recognition. "You are unconscious, sir," I said. "Where am I, young man?" he asked wearily. "This is the Golden Day, sir." "What? The Golden Day?" "It's a kind of sporting and gambling house," I added reluctantly. "Now give him another drink of brandy," Hallie said. I poured a drink and handed it to him. He sniffed it, closed his eyes as in puzzlement, then drank. His cheeks filled out like small bellows. He was rinsing his mouth. "Thank you," he said, a little stronger now. "What is this place?" "The Golden Day," said several patients in unison. He looked slowly around him, up to the balcony, with its scrolled and carved wood. A large flag hung lank above the floor. He frowned. "What was this building used for in the past?" he said. "It was a church, then a bank, then it was a restaurant and a fancy gambling house, and now we got it," Hallie explained. "I think somebody said it used to be a jailhouse too. They let us come here once a week to raise a little hell," someone said. "I couldn't buy a drink to take out, sir, so I had to bring you inside," I explained in dread. He looked about him. I followed his eyes and was amazed to see the varied expressions on the patients' faces as they silently returned his gaze. Some were hostile, some cringing, some horrified, some, who when among themselves were most violent, now appeared as submissive as children. And some seemed strangely amused. "Are all of you patients?" Mr. Norton asked. "Me, I just runs the joint," Hallie said. "These here other fellows were patients sent here as therapy," a short, fat, very intelligent-looking man said. "But," he smiled, "they send along an attendant, a kind of censor, to see that the therapy fails." "You're nuts." "I'm a dynamo of energy. I come to charge my batteries," one of the vets insisted. "I'm a student of history, sir," another interrupted with dramatic gestures. "The world moves in a circle like a roulette wheel. In the beginning, black is on top, in the middle epochs, white holds the odds, but soon Ethiopia shall stretch forth her noble wings. Then place your money on the black." His voice throbbed with emotion. "Until then, the sun holds no heat, there's ice in the heart of the earth. 2 years from now and I'll be old enough to give my mulatto mother a bath, the half-white bitch," he added, beginning to leap up and down in an explosion of glassy-eyed fury. Mr. Norton blinked his eyes and straightened up. "I'm a physician, may I take your pulse?" Burnside said, seizing Mr. Norton's wrist. "Don't pay him no mind, mister. He ain't been no doctor in 10 years. They caught him trying to change some blood into money. I did too." The man screamed. "I discovered it and John D. Rockefeller stole the formula from me." "Mr. Rockefeller did you say?" Mr. Norton said. "I'm sure you must be mistaken. What's going on down there?" a voice shouted from the balcony. Everyone turned. I saw a huge black giant of a man, dressed only in white shorts, swaying on the stairs. It was Supercargo, the attendant. I hardly recognized him without his hard starched white uniform. Usually he walked around threatening the men with a straitjacket which he always carried over his arm, and usually they were quiet and submissive in his presence. But now they seemed not to recognize him and began shouting curses. "How you gon' keep order in the place if you gon' get drunk?" Hallie shouted. "Charlene." "Charlene." "Yeah?" A woman's voice, startling in its carrying power, answered sulkily from the room off the balcony. "I want you to get that stool pigeoning, joy-killing, nut-crushing bum back in there with you and sober him up. Then get him in his white suit and down here to keep order." We got white folks in the house. A woman appeared on the balcony, drawing a woolly pink robe about her. Now you listen here, Hallie, she drawled, I'm a woman. If you want him dressed, you can do it yourself. I don't put on but one man's clothes and he's in Nerlanes. Never mind all that. Get that stool pigeon sober. I want order down there, supercargo boomed, and if there's white folks down there, I wants double order. Suddenly there was an angry roar from the men back near the bar and I saw them rush the stairs. Get him. Let's give him some order. Out of my way. 5 men charged the stairs. I saw the giant bend and clutch the posts at the top of the stairs with both hands, bracing himself, his body gleaming bare in his white shorts. The little man who had slapped Mr. Norton was in front, and, as he sprang up the long flight, I saw the attendant set himself and kick, catching the little man just as he reached the top, hard in the chest, sending him backwards in a curving dive into the midst of the men behind him. Supercargo got set to swing his leg again. It was a narrow stair and only one man could get up at a time. As fast as they rushed up, the giant kicked them back. He swung his leg, kicking them down like a fungo hitter batting out flies. Watching him, I forgot Mr. Norton. The golden day was in an uproar. Half-dressed women appeared from the rooms off the balcony. Men hooted and yelled as at a football game. I want order. The giant shouted as he sent a man flying down the flight of stairs. They throwing bottles of liquor. A woman screamed. Real liquor. That's a order he don't want, someone said. A shower of bottles and glasses splashing whiskey crashed against the balcony. I saw Supercargo snap suddenly erect and grab his forehead, his face bathed in whiskey. He cried, ee. Then I saw him waver, rigid from his ankles upward. For a moment the men on the stairs were motionless, watching him. Then they sprang forward. Supercargo grabbed wildly at the balustrade as they snatched his feet from beneath him and started down. His head bounced against the steps making a sound like a series of gunshots as they ran dragging him by his ankles, like volunteer firemen running with a hose. The crowd surged forward. Hallie yelled near my ear. I saw the man being dragged toward the center of the room. Give the bastard some order. Here I'm 45 and he's been acting like he's my old man. So you like to kick, huh? A tall man said, aiming a shoe at the attendant's head. The flesh above his right eye jumped out as though it had been inflated. Then I heard Mr. Norton beside me shouting, no, not when he's down. Listen at the white folks, someone said. He's the white folks man. Men were jumping upon Supercargo with both feet now and I felt such an excitement that I wanted to join them. Even the girls were yelling, give it to him good. He never pays me. Kill him. Please, y'all, not here. Not in my place. You can't speak your mind when he's on duty. Hell, no. Somehow I got pushed away from Mr. Norton and found myself beside the man called Sylvester. Watch this, schoolboy, he said. See there, where his ribs are bleeding. I nodded my head. Now don't move your eyes. I watched the spot as though compelled, just beneath the lower rib and above the hip bone, as Sylvester measured carefully with his toe and kicked as though he were punting a football. Supercargo let out a groan like an injured horse. Try it, schoolboy, it feels so good. It gives you relief, Sylvester said. Sometimes I get so afraid of him I feel that he's inside my head. There. He said, giving Supercargo another kick. As I watched, a man sprang on Supercargo's chest with both feet and he lost consciousness. They began throwing cold beer on him, reviving him, only to kick him unconscious again. Soon he was drenched in blood and beer. The bastard's out cold. Throw him out. Nah, wait a minute. Give me a hand somebody. They threw him upon the bar, stretching him out with his arms folded across his chest like a corpse. Now, let's have a drink. Hallie was slow in getting behind the bar and they cursed him. Get back there and serve us, you big sack of fat. Gimme a rye. Up here, funk buster. Shake them sloppy hips. Okay, take it easy, Hallie said, rushing to pour them drinks. "Just put y'all's money where your mouth is." With supercargo lying helpless upon the bar, the men whirled about like maniacs. The excitement seemed to have tilted some of the more delicately balanced ones too far. Some made hostile speeches at the top of their voices against the hospital, the state and the universe. The one who called himself a composer was banging away the one wild piece he seemed to know on the out-of-tune piano, striking the keyboard with fists and elbows and filling in other effects in a bass voice that moaned like a bear in agony. One of the most educated ones touched my arm. He was a former chemist who was never seen without his shining Phi Beta Kappa key. "The men have lost control," he said through the uproar. "I think you'd better leave." "I'm trying to," I said, "as soon as I can get over to Mr. Norton." Mr. Norton was gone from where I had left him. I rushed here and there through the noisy men, calling his name. When I found him, he was under the stairs. Somehow he had been pushed there by the scuffling, reeling men, and he lay sprawled in the chair like an aged doll. In the dim light his features were sharp and white and his closed eyes well-defined lines in a well-tooled face. I shouted his name above the roar of the men, and got no answer. He was out again. I shook him, gently, then roughly, but still no flicker of his wrinkled lids. Then some of the milling men pushed me up against him, and suddenly a mass of whiteness was looming 2 inches from my eyes. It was only his face, but I felt a shudder of nameless horror. I had never been so close to a white person before. In a panic I struggled to get away. With his eyes closed he seemed more threatening than with them open. He was like a formless white death, suddenly appeared before me, a death which had been there all the time and which had now revealed itself in the madness of the golden day. "Stop screaming!" a voice commanded, and I felt myself pulled away. It was the short fat man. I clamped my mouth shut, aware for the first time that the shrill sound was coming from my own throat. I saw the man's face relax as he gave me a wry smile. "That's better," he shouted into my ear. "He's only a man. Remember that. He's only a man." I wanted to tell him that Mr. Norton was much more than that he was a rich white man and in my charge, but the very idea that I was responsible for him was too much for me to put into words. "Let us take him to the balcony," the man said, pushing me toward Mr. Norton's feet. I moved automatically, grasping the thin ankles as he raised the white man by the armpits and backed from beneath the stairs. Mr. Norton's head lolled upon his chest as though he were drunk or dead. The vet started up the steps still smiling, climbing backwards a step at a time. I had begun to worry about him, whether he was drunk like the rest, when I saw 3 of the girls who had been leaning over the balustrade watching the brawl come down to help us carry Mr. Norton up. "Looks like Pops couldn't take it," one of them shouted. "He's high as a Georgia pine." "Yeah, I tell you this stuff Hallie got out here is too strong for white folks to drink." "Not drunk, ill," the fat man said. "Go find a bed that's not being used so he can stretch out a while." "Show, Daddy. Is there any other little favors I can do for you?" "That'll be enough," he said. One of the girls ran up ahead. "Mine's just been changed." "Bring him down here," she said. In a few minutes Mr. Norton was lying upon a 3/4 bed, faintly breathing. I watched the fat man bend over him very professionally and feel for his pulse. "You a doctor?" a girl asked. "Not now, I'm a patient. But I have a certain knowledge." "Another one," I thought, pushing him quickly aside. "He'll be all right. Let him come to so I can get him out of here." "You needn't worry, I'm not like those down there, young fellow," he said. "I really was a doctor. I won't hurt him. He's had a mild shock of some kind." We watched him bend over Mr. Norton again, feeling his pulse, pulling back his eyelid. "It's a mild shock," he repeated. "This here golden day is enough to shock anybody," a girl said, smoothing her apron over the smooth sensuous roll of her stomach. Another brushed Mr. Norton's white hair away from his forehead and stroked it, smiling vacantly. "He's kinda cute," she said. "Just like a little white baby." "What kinda ole baby?" the small skinny girl asked. "That's the kind, "An ole baby. You just like white men, Edna." "That's all," the skinny one said. Edna shook her head and smiled as though amused at herself. "I sure do. I just love 'em. Now this one, old as he is, he could put his shoes under my bed any night. Shucks, me I'd kill an old man like that." "Kill him nothing," Edna said. "Girl, don't you know that all these rich ole white men got monkey glands and billy goat balls? These ole bastards don't never get enough. They want to have the whole world." The doctor looked at me and smiled. "See, now you're learning all about endocrinology," he said. "I was wrong when I told you that he was only a man. It seems now that he's either part goat or part ape. Maybe he's both." "It's the truth," Edna said. "I used to have me one in Chicago." "Now you ain't never been to no Chicago, gal," the other one interrupted. "How you know I ain't?" "2 years ago." "Shucks, you don't know nothing. That ole white man right there might have him a couple of jackass balls." The fat man raised up with a quick grin. "As a scientist and a physician, I'm forced to discount that," he said. "That is one operation that has yet to be performed." Then he managed to get the girls out of the room. If he should come around and hear that conversation, the vet said, it would be enough to send him off again. Besides, their scientific curiosity might lead them to investigate whether he really does have a monkey gland. And that, I'm afraid, would be a bit obscene. "I've got to get him back to the school," I said. "All right," he said, "I'll do what I can to help you. Go see if you can find some ice. And don't worry." I went out on the balcony, seeing the tops of their heads. They were still milling around, the jukebox playing, the piano thumping, and over at the end of the room, drenched with beer, supercargo lay like a spent horse upon the bar. Starting down, I noticed a large piece of ice glinting in the remains of an abandoned drink and seized its coldness in my hot hand and hurried back to the room. The vet sat staring at Mr. Norton, who now breathed with a slightly irregular sound. "You are quick," the man said, as he stood and reached for the ice. "Swift with the speed of anxiety," he added, as if to himself. "Hand me that clean towel, there, from beside the basin." I handed him one, seeing him fold the ice inside it and apply it to Mr. Norton's face. "Is he all right?" I said. "He will be in a few minutes." "What happened to him?" "I took him for a drive," I said. "Did you have an accident or something?" "No," I said. "He just talked to a farmer and the heat knocked him out. Then we got caught in the mob downstairs." "How old is he?" "I don't know, but he's one of the trustees." "One of the very first, no doubt," he said, dabbing at the blue-veined eyes. "A trustee of consciousness." "What was that?" I asked. "Nothing. There now, he's coming out of it." I had an impulse to run out of the room. I feared what Mr. Norton would say to me, the expression that might come into his eyes. And yet, I was afraid to leave. My eyes could not leave the face with its flickering lids. The head moved from side to side in the pale glow of the light bulb, as though denying some insistent voice which I could not hear. Then the lids opened, revealing pale pools of blue vagueness that finally solidified into points that froze upon the vet, who looked down unsmilingly. Men like us did not look at a man like Mr. Norton in that manner, and I stepped hurriedly forward. "He's a real doctor, sir," I said. "I'll explain," the vet said. "Get a glass of water." I hesitated. He looked at me firmly. "Get the water," he said, turning to help Mr. Norton to sit up. Outside I asked Edna for a glass of water and she led me down the hall to a small kitchen, drawing it for me from a green old-fashioned cooler. "I got some good liquor, baby, if you want to give him a drink," she said. "This will do," I said. My hands trembled so that the water spilled. When I returned, Mr. Norton was sitting up unaided, carrying on a conversation with the vet. "Here's some water, sir," I said, extending the glass. He took it. "Thank you," he said. "Not too much," the vet cautioned. "Your diagnosis is exactly that of my specialist," Mr. Norton said, "and I went to several fine physicians before one could diagnose it. How did you know? I too was a specialist, the vet said. But how? Only a few men in the whole country possess the knowledge, then one of them is an inmate of a semi-madhouse, the vet said. But there's nothing mysterious about it. I escaped for a while. I went to France with the Army Medical Corps and remained there after the armistice to study and practice. Oh yes, and how long were you in France? Mr. Norton asked. Long enough, he said. Long enough to forget some fundamentals which I should never have forgotten. What fundamentals? Mr. Norton said. What do you mean? The vet smiled and cocked his head. Things about life. Such things as most peasants and folk peoples almost always know through experience, though seldom through conscious thought. Pardon me, sir, I said to Mr. Norton, but now that you feel better, shouldn't we go? Not just yet, he said. Then to the doctor, I'm very interested. What happened to you? A drop of water caught in one of his eyebrows glittered like a chip of active diamond. I went over and sat on a chair. Damn this vet to hell. Are you sure you would like to hear? The vet asked. Why, of course. Then perhaps the young fella should go downstairs and wait. The sound of shouting and destruction welled up from below as I opened the door. No, perhaps you should stay, the fat man said. Perhaps had I overheard some of what I'm about to tell you when I was a student up there on the hill, I wouldn't be the casualty that I am. Sit down, young man, Mr. Norton ordered. So you were a student at the college, he said to the vet. I sat down again, worrying about Dr. Bledsoe as the fat man told Mr. Norton of his attending college, then becoming a physician and going to France during the World War. Were you a successful physician? Mr. Norton said. Fairly so. I performed a few brain surgeries that won me some small attention. Then why did you return? Nostalgia, the vet said. Then what on earth are you doing here in this? Mr. Norton said, with your ability. Ulcers, the fat man said. That's terribly unfortunate, but why should ulcers stop your career? Not really, but I learned along with the ulcers that my work could bring me no dignity, the vet said. Now you sound bitter, Mr. Norton said, just as the door flew open. A brown-skinned woman with red hair looked in. How's white folks making out? She said, staggering inside. White folks, baby, you done come to. You want a drink? Not now, Hester, the vet said. He's still a little weak. He sure looks it. That's how come he needs a drink. Put some iron in his blood. Now, Hester. Okay. But what y'all doing looking like you at a funeral? Don't you know this is the golden day? She staggered toward me, belching elegantly and reeling. Just look at y'all. Here schoolboy looks like he's scared to death. And white folks here is acting like y'all two strange poodles. Be happy y'all. I'm going down and get Hallie to send you up some drinks. She patted Mr. Norton's cheek as she went past and I saw him turn a glowing red. Be happy, white folks. Aha. The vet laughed. You're blushing, which means that you're better. Don't be embarrassed. Hester is a great humanitarian, a therapist of generous nature and great skill, and the possessor of a healing touch. Her catharsis is absolutely tremendous. Ha. You do look better, sir, I said, anxious to get out of the place. I could understand the vet's words but not what they conveyed, and Mr. Norton looked as uncomfortable as I felt. The one thing which I did know was that the vet was acting toward the white man with a freedom which could only bring on trouble. I wanted to tell Mr. Norton that the man was crazy, and yet I received a fearful satisfaction from hearing him talk as he had to a white man. With the girl it was different. A woman usually got away with things a man never could. I was wet with anxiety, but the vet talked on, ignoring the interruption. Rest, he said, fixing Mr. Norton with his eyes. The clocks are all set back and the forces of destruction are rampant down below. They might suddenly realize that you are what you are, and then your life wouldn't be worth a piece of bankrupt stock. You would be cancelled, perforated, voided, become the recognized magnet attracting loose screws. Then what would you do? Such men are beyond money, and with supercargo down, out like a felled ox, they know nothing of value. To some, you are the great white father, to others the lyncher of souls, but for all, you are confusion come even into the golden day. What are you talking about? I said, thinking, lyncher? He was getting wilder than the men downstairs. I didn't dare look at Mr. Norton, who made a sound of protest. The vet frowned. It is an issue which I can confront only by evading it. An utterly stupid proposition, and these hands so lovingly trained to master a scalpel yearn to caress a trigger. I returned to save life and I was refused, he said. 10 men in masks drove me out from the city at midnight and beat me with whips for saving a human life. And I was forced to the utmost degradation because I possessed skilled hands and the belief that my knowledge could bring me dignity, not wealth, only dignity, and other men health. Then suddenly he fixed me with his eyes. And now, do you understand? What? I said. What you've heard. I don't know. Why? I said, I really think it's time we left. You see, he said turning to Mr. Norton, he has eyes and ears and a good distended African nose, but he fails to understand the simple facts of life. Understand? Understand? It's worse than that. He registers with his senses but short-circuits his brain. Nothing has meaning. He takes it in but he doesn't digest it. Already he is, well, bless my soul. Behold. A walking zombie. Already he's learned to repress not only his emotions but his humanity. He's invisible, a walking personification of the negative, the most perfect achievement of your dreams, sir. The mechanical man. Mr. Norton looked amazed. Tell me, the vet said, suddenly calm. Why have you been interested in the school, Mr. Norton? Out of a sense of my destined role, Mr. Norton said shakily. I felt, and I still feel, that your people are in some important manner tied to my destiny. What do you mean, destiny? The vet said. Why, the success of my work, of course. I see. And would you recognize it if you saw it? Why, of course I would, Mr. Norton said indignantly. I've watched it grow each year I've returned to the campus. Campus? Why the campus? It is there that my destiny is being made. The vet exploded with laughter. The campus, what a destiny. He stood and walked around the narrow room, laughing. Then he stopped as suddenly as he had begun. You will hardly recognize it, but it is very fitting that you came to the golden day with the young fellow, he said. I came out of illness, or rather, he brought me, Mr. Norton said. Of course, but you came, and it was fitting. What do you mean? Mr. Norton said with irritation. A little child shall lead them, the vet said with a smile. But seriously, because you both fail to understand what is happening to you. You cannot see or hear or smell the truth of what you see, and you, looking for destiny. It's classic. And the boy, this automaton, he was made of the very mud of the region and he sees far less than you. Poor stumblers, neither of you can see the other. To you he is a mark on the scorecard of your achievement, a thing and not a man, a child, or even less, a black amorphous thing. And you, for all your power, are not a man to him, but a god, a force. Mr. Norton stood abruptly. Let us go, young man, he said angrily. No, listen. He believes in you as he believes in the beat of his heart. He believes in that great false wisdom taught slaves and pragmatists alike, that white is right. I can tell you his destiny. He'll do your bidding, and for that his blindness is his chief asset. He's your man, friend. Your man and your destiny. Now the two of you descend the stairs into chaos and get the hell out of here. I'm sick of both of you pitiful obscenities. Get out before I do you both the favor of bashing in your heads. I saw his motion toward the big white pitcher on the washstand and stepped between him and Mr. Norton, guiding Mr. Norton swiftly through the doorway. Looking back, I saw him leaning against the wall making a sound that was a blending of laughter and tears. Hurry, the man is as insane as the rest, Mr. Norton said. Yes, sir, I said, noticing a new note in his voice. The balcony was now as noisy as the floor below. The girls and drunken vets were stumbling about with drinks in their hands. Just as we went past an open door, Edna saw us and grabbed my arm. "Where you taking white folks?" she demanded. "Back to school," I said, shaking her off. "You don't want to go up there, white folks, baby," she said. I tried to push past her. "I ain't lying," she said. "I'm the best little homemaker in the business." "Okay, but please let us alone," I pleaded. "You'll get me into trouble." We were going down the stairs into the milling men now, and she started to scream, "Pay me then. If he's too good for me, let him pay." And before I could stop her, she had pushed Mr. Norton, and both of us were stumbling swiftly down the stairs. I landed against a man who looked up with the anonymous familiarity of a drunk and shoved me hard away. I saw Mr. Norton spin past as I sank farther into the crowd. Somewhere I could hear the girl screaming and Hallie's voice yelling, "Hey! Hey! Hey, now!" Then I was aware of fresh air and saw that I was near the door and pushed my way free and stood panting and preparing to plunge back for Mr. Norton, when I heard Hallie calling, "Make way, y'all!" and saw him piloting Mr. Norton to the door. "Phew!" he said, releasing the white man and shaking his huge head. "Thanks, Hallie," I said, and got no further. I saw Mr. Norton, his face pale again, his white suit rumpled, topple and fall, his head scraping against the screen of the door. "Hey!" I opened the door and raised him up. "God damn it, out again," Hallie said. "How come you bring this white man here, schoolboy? Is he dead?" "Dead," he said, stepping back indignantly. "He can't die." "What'll I do, Hallie?" "Not in my place, he can't die," he said, kneeling. Mr. Norton looked up. "No one is dead or dying," he said acidly. "Remove your hands." Hallie fell away, surprised. "I sure am glad. You show you all right? I thought show you was dead this time." "For God's sake, be quiet," I exploded nervously. "You should be glad that he's all right." Mr. Norton was visibly angry now, a raw place showing on his forehead, and I hurried ahead of him to the car. He climbed in unaided, and I got under the wheel, smelling the heated odor of mints and cigar smoke. He was silent as I drove away. Chapter 4. The wheel felt like an alien thing in my hands as I followed the white line of the highway. Heat rays from the late afternoon sun arose from the gray concrete, shimmering like the weary tones of a distant bugle blown upon still midnight air. In the mirror I could see Mr. Norton staring out vacantly upon the empty fields, his mouth stern, his white forehead livid where it had scraped the screen. And seeing him, I felt the fear bald coldly within me unfold. What would happen now? What would the school officials say? In my mind I visualized Dr. Bledsoe's face when he saw Mr. Norton. I thought of the glee certain folks at home would feel if I were expelled. Tatlock's grinning face danced through my mind. What would the white folks think who'd sent me to college? Was Mr. Norton angry at me? In the golden day he had seemed more curious than anything else, until the vet had started talking wild. Damn Trueblood. It was his fault. If we hadn't sat in the sun so long, Mr. Norton would not have needed whiskey and I wouldn't have gone to the golden day. And why would the vets act that way with a white man in the house? I headed the car through the red brick campus gateposts with a sense of cold apprehension. Now even the rows of neat dormitories seemed to threaten me, the rolling lawns appearing as hostile as the gray highway with its white dividing line. As of its own compulsion, the car slowed as we passed the chapel with its slow, sweeping eaves. The sun shone coolly through the avenue of trees, dappling the curving drive. Students strolled through the shade, down a hill of tender grass toward the brick-red stretch of tennis courts. Far beyond, players in whites showed sharp against the red of the courts surrounded by grass, a gay vista washed by the sun. In the brief interval I heard a cheer rise. My predicament struck me like a stab. I had a sense of losing control of the car and slammed on the brakes in the middle of the road, then apologized and drove on. Here within this quiet greenness I possessed the only identity I had ever known, and I was losing it. In this brief moment of passage I became aware of the connection between these lawns and buildings and my hopes and dreams. I wanted to stop the car and talk with Mr. Norton, to beg his pardon for what he had seen, to plead and show him tears, unashamed tears like those of a child before his parent, to denounce all we'd seen and heard, to assure him that far from being like any of the people we had seen, I hated them, that I believed in the principles of the founder with all my heart and soul, and that I believed in his own goodness and kindness in extending the hand of his benevolence to helping us poor, ignorant people out of the mire and darkness. I would do his bidding and teach others to rise up as he wished them to, teach them to be thrifty, decent, upright citizens, contributing to the welfare of all, shunning all but the straight and narrow path that he and the founder had stretched before us. If only he were not angry with me. If only he would give me another chance. Tears filled my eyes, and the walks and buildings flowed and froze for a moment in mist, glittering as in winter when rain froze on the grass and foliage and turned the campus into a world of whiteness, weighting and bending both trees and bushes with fruit of crystal. Then in the twinkling of my eyes, it was gone, and the here and now of heat and greenness returned. If only I could make Mr. Norton understand what the school meant to me. "Shall I stop at your rooms, sir?" I said. "Or shall I take you to the administration building? Dr. Bledsoe might be worried." "To my rooms, then bring Dr. Bledsoe to me," he answered tersely. "Yes, sir." In the mirror I saw him dabbing gingerly at his forehead with a crinkled handkerchief. "You'd better send the school physician to me also," he said. I stopped the car in front of a small building with white pillars like those of an old plantation manor house, got out and opened the door. "Mr. Norton, please, sir." "I'm sorry." He looked at me sternly, his eyes narrowed, saying nothing. "I didn't know." "Please. Send Dr. Bledsoe to me," he said, turning away and swinging up the graveled path to the building. I got back into the car and drove slowly to the administration building. A girl waved gaily as I passed, a bunch of violets in her hand. Two teachers in dark suits talked decorously beside a broken fountain. The building was quiet. Going upstairs I visualized Dr. Bledsoe, with his broad globular face that seemed to take its form from the fat pressing from the inside, which, as air pressing against the membrane of a balloon, gave it shape and buoyancy. "Old Buckethead," some of the fellows called him. I never had. He had been kind to me from the first, perhaps because of the letters which the school superintendent had sent to him when I arrived. But more than that, he was the example of everything I hoped to be, influential with wealthy men all over the country, consulted in matters concerning the race, a leader of his people, the possessor of not one, but 2 Cadillacs, a good salary and a soft, good-looking and creamy-complexioned wife. What was more, while black and bald and everything white folks poked fun at, he had achieved power and authority, had, while black and wrinkle-headed, made himself of more importance in the world than most Southern white men. They could laugh at him but they couldn't ignore him. "He's been looking all over for you," the girl at the desk said. When I walked in he looked up from the telephone and said, "Never mind, he's here now," and hung up. "Where's Mr. Norton?" he demanded excitedly. "Is he all right?" "Yes, sir. I left him at his rooms and came to drive you down. He wishes to see you." "Is anything wrong?" he said, getting up hurriedly and coming around the desk. I hesitated. "Well, is there?" The panicky beating of my heart seemed to blur my vision. "Not now, sir." "Now? What do you mean?" "Well, sir, he had some kind of fainting spell." "Oh, my God." I knew something was wrong. "Why didn't you get in touch with me?" He grabbed his black Homburg, starting for the door. "Come on." I followed him, trying to explain. "He's all over it now, sir, and we were too far away for me to phone." "Why did you take him so far?" he said, moving with great bustling energy. "But I drove him where he wanted to go, sir." "Where was that?" "Back of the slave quarter section," I said with dread. "The quarters." "Boy, are you a fool? Didn't you know better than to take a trustee out there?" He asked me to, sir. We were going down the walk now, through the spring air, and he stopped to look at me with exasperation, as though I'd suddenly told him black was white. "Damn what he wants," he said, climbing in the front seat beside me. "Haven't you the sense God gave a dog? We take these white folks where we want them to go, we show them what we want them to see. Don't you know that? I thought you had some sense." Reaching Rab Hall, I stopped the car, weak with bewilderment. "Don't sit there," he said. "Come with me." Just inside the building I got another shock. As we approached a mirror, Dr. Bledsoe stopped and composed his angry face like a sculptor, making it a bland mask, leaving only the sparkle of his eyes to betray the emotion that I had seen only a moment before. He looked steadily at himself for a moment, then we moved quietly down the silent hall and up the stairs. A co-ed sat at a graceful table stacked with magazines. Before a great window stood a large aquarium containing colored stones and a small replica of a feudal castle surrounded by goldfish that seemed to remain motionless despite the fluttering of their lacy fins, a momentary motionful suspension of time. "Is Mr. Norton in his room?" he said to the girl. "Yes, sir, Dr. Bledsoe, sir," she said. "He said to tell you to come in when you got here." Pausing at the door, I heard him clear his throat, then rap softly upon the panel with his fist. "Mr. Norton?" he said, his lips already a smile. And at the answer I followed him inside. It was a large light room. Mr. Norton sat in a huge wing chair with his jacket off. A change of clothing lay on the cool bedspread. Above a spacious fireplace an oil portrait of the founder looked down at me remotely, benign, sad, and in that hot instant, profoundly disillusioned. Then a veil seemed to fall. "I've been worried about you, sir," Dr. Bledsoe said. "We expected you at the afternoon session. Now it's beginning," I thought. "Now," and suddenly he rushed forward. "Mr. Norton, your head!" he cried, a strange grandmotherly concern in his voice. "What happened, sir?" "It's nothing." Mr. Norton's face was immobile. "A mere scratch." Dr. Bledsoe whirled around, his face outraged. "Get the doctor over here," he said. "Why didn't you tell me that Mr. Norton had been injured?" "I've already taken care of that, sir," I said softly, seeing him whirl back. "Mr. Norton, Mr. Norton. I'm so sorry," he crooned. "I thought I had sent you a boy who was careful, a sensible young man. Why, we've never had an accident before. Never, not in 75 years. I assure you, sir, that he shall be disciplined, severely disciplined." "But there was no automobile accident," Mr. Norton said kindly, "nor was the boy responsible. You may send him away, we won't need him now." My eyes suddenly filled. I felt a wave of gratitude at his words. "Don't be kind, sir," Dr. Bledsoe said. "You can't be soft with these people. We mustn't pamper them. An accident to a guest of this college while he is in the charge of a student is without question the student's fault. That's one of our strictest rules." Then to me, "Return to your dormitory and remain there until further notice." "But it was out of my control, sir," I said, just as Mr. Norton said. "I'll explain, young man," Mr. Norton said with a half smile. "Everything will be explained." "Thank you, sir," I said, seeing Dr. Bledsoe looking at me with no change of expression. "On second thought," he said, "I want you to be in chapel this evening, understand me, sir?" "Yes, sir." I opened the door with a cold hand, bumping into the girl who had been at the table when we went inside. "I'm sorry," she said. "Looks like you have old Buckethead kind of mad." I said nothing as she walked beside me expectantly. A red sun cast its light upon the campus as I started for my dormitory. "Will you take a message to my boyfriend for me?" she said. "Who is he?" I said, trying hard to conceal my tension and fear. "Jack Maston," she said. "Okay, he's in the room next to mine." "That's swell," she said with a big smile. "The dean put me on duty so I missed him this afternoon." Just tell him that I said the grass is green." "What? The grass is green? It's our secret code, he'll understand." "The grass is green," I said. "That's it. Thank you, lover," she said. I felt like cursing as I watched her hurrying back into the building, hearing her flat-heeled shoes crunching the graveled walk. Here she was playing with some silly secret code at the very minute my fate for the rest of my life was being decided. The grass was green and they'd meet and she'd be sent home pregnant, but even so, in less disgrace than I. If only I knew what they were saying about me. Suddenly I had an idea and ran after her, into the building and up the stairs. In the hall, fine dust played in a shaft of sunlight, stirred by her hurried passing. But she had disappeared. I had thought to ask her to listen at the door and tell me what was said. I gave it up. If she were discovered, I'd have that on my conscience too. Besides, I was ashamed for anyone to know of my predicament. It was too stupid to be believed. Down the long length of the wide hall I heard someone unseen skipping down the stairs singing. A girl's sweet, hopeful voice. I left quietly and hurried to my dorm. I lay in my room with my eyes closed, trying to think. The tension gripped my insides. Then I heard someone coming up the hall and stiffened. Had they sent for me already? Nearby a door opened and closed, leaving me as tense as ever. To whom could I turn for help? I could think of no one. No one to whom I could even explain what had happened at the Golden Day. Everything was upset inside me. And Dr. Bledsoe's attitude toward Mr. Norton was the most confusing of all. I dared not repeat what he'd said, for fear that it would lessen my chances of remaining in school. It just wasn't true. I had misunderstood. He couldn't have said what I thought he had said. Hadn't I seen him approach white visitors too often with his hat in hand, bowing humbly and respectfully? Hadn't he refused to eat in the dining hall with white guests of the school, entering only after they had finished and then refusing to sit down, but remaining standing, his hat in his hand, while he addressed them eloquently, then leaving with a humble bow? Hadn't he? I had seen him too often as I peeped through the door between the dining room and the kitchen, I myself. And wasn't his favorite spiritual live humble? And in the chapel on Sunday evenings upon the platform, hadn't he always taught us to live content in our place in 1,000 unambiguous words? He had, and I had believed him. I had believed without question his illustrations of the good which came of following the Founder's path. It was my affirmation of life, and they couldn't send me away for something I didn't do. They simply couldn't. But that vet. He was so crazy that he corrupted sane men. He had tried to turn the world inside out, goddamn him. He had made Mr. Norton angry. He had no right to talk to a white man as he had, not with me to take the punishment. Someone shook me and I recoiled, my legs moist and trembling. It was my roommate. "What the hell, roomie," he said. "Let's go to chow." I looked at his confident mug. He was going to be a farmer. "I don't have an appetite," I said with a sigh. "Okay now," he said, "you can try to kid me, but don't say I didn't wake you." "No," I said. "Who are you expecting, a broad-butt gal with ball-bearing hips?" "No," I said. "You'd better stop that, roomie," he grinned. "It'll ruin your health, make you a moron. You ought to take you a gal and show her how the moon rises over all that green grass on the Founder's grave, man." "Go to hell," I said. He left laughing, opening the door to the sound of many footsteps from the hall. Supper time. The sound of departing voices. Something of my life seemed to retreat with them into a gray distance, moiling. Then a knock sounded at the door and I sprang up, my heart tense. A small student wearing a freshman's cap stuck his head in the door, shouting, "Dr. Bledsoe said he wants to see you down at Rab Hall." And then he was gone before I could question him, his footsteps thundering down the hall as he raced to dinner before the last bell sounded. At Mr. Norton's door I stopped with my hand on the knob, mumbling a prayer. "Come in, young man," he said to my knock. He was dressed in fresh linen, the light falling upon his white hair as upon silk floss. A small piece of gauze was plastered to his forehead. He was alone. "I'm sorry, sir," I apologized, "but I was told that Dr. Bledsoe wanted to see me here." "That's correct," he said, "but Dr. Bledsoe had to leave. You'll find him in his office after chapel." "Thank you, sir," I said and turned to go. He cleared his throat behind me. "Young man." I turned hopefully. "Young man, I have explained to Dr. Bledsoe that you were not at fault. I believe he understands." I was so relieved that at first I could only look at him, a small silken-haired, white-suited St. Nicholas, seen through misty eyes. "I certainly do thank you, sir," I managed finally. He studied me silently, his eyes slightly narrowed. "Will you need me this evening, sir?" I asked. "No, I won't be needing the machine. Business is taking me away sooner than I expected. I leave late tonight." "I could drive you to the station, sir," I said hopefully. "Thank you, but Dr. Bledsoe has already arranged it." "Oh," I said with disappointment. I had hoped that by serving him the rest of the week I could win back his esteem. Now I would not have the opportunity. "Well, I hope you have a pleasant trip, sir," I said. "Thank you," he said, suddenly smiling. "And maybe next time you come I'll be able to answer some of the questions you asked me this afternoon." "Questions?" His eyes narrowed. "Yes, sir, about your fate," I said. "Ah, yes, yes," he said. "And I intend to read Emerson, too." "Very good. Self-reliance is a most worthy virtue. I shall look forward with the greatest of interest to learning your contribution to my fate." He motioned me toward the door. "And don't forget to see Dr. Bledsoe." I left somewhat reassured, but not completely. I still had to face Dr. Bledsoe. And I had to attend chapel. Chapter 5. At the sound of Vespers I moved across the campus with groups of students, walking slowly, their voices soft in the mellow dusk. I remember the yellowed globes of frosted glass making lacy silhouettes on the gravel and the walk of the leaves and branches above us as we moved slow through the dusk so restless with scents of lilac, honeysuckle and verbena, and the feel of spring greenness, and I recall the sudden arpeggios of laughter lilting across the tender, springtime grass, gay welling, far-floating, fluent, spontaneous, a bell-like feminine fluting, then suppressed, as though snuffed swiftly and irrevocably beneath the quiet solemnity of the vesper air now vibrant with somber chapel bells. Dong. 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 Above the decorous walking around me, sounds of footsteps leaving the verandas of far-flung buildings and moving toward the walks and over the walks to the asphalt drives lined with whitewashed stones, those cryptic messages for men and women, boys and girls heading quietly toward where the visitors waited, and we moving not in the mood of worship but of judgment, as though even here in the filtering dusk, here beneath the deep indigo sky, here, alive with looping swifts and darting moths, here in the hairness of the night not yet lighted by the moon that looms blood-red behind the chapel like a fallen sun, its radiance shedding not upon the here dusk of twittering bats, nor on the there night of cricket and whip-poor-will, but focused short-rayed upon our place of convergence, and we drifting forward with rigid motions, limbs stiff and voices now silent, as though on exhibit even in the dark, and the moon a white man's bloodshot eye. And I move more rigid than all the others with a sense of judgment, the vibrations of the chapel bell stirring the depths of my turmoil, moving toward its nexus with a sense of doom. And I remember the chapel with its sweeping eaves, long and low as though risen bloody from the earth like the rising moon, vine-covered and earth-colored as though more earth-sprung than man-sprung. And my mind rushing for relief away from the spring dusk and flower scents, away from the time scene of the crucifixion to the time mood of the birth, from spring dusk and vespers to the high, clear, lucid moon of winter and snow glinting upon the dwarfed pines where instead of the bells, the organ and the trombone choirs speak carols to the distances drifted with snow, making of the night air a sea of crystal water lapping the slumbering land to the farthest reaches of sound, for endless miles, bringing the new dispensation even to the golden day, even unto the house of madness. But in the hairness of dusk I am moving toward the doom-like bells through the flowered air, beneath the rising moon. Into the doors and into the soft lights I go, silently, past the rows of puritanical benches straight and tortuous, finding that to which I am assigned and bending my body to its agony. There at the head of the platform with its pulpit and rail of polished brass are the banked and pyramided heads of the student choir, faces composed and stolid above uniforms of black and white, and above them, stretching to the ceiling, the organ pipes looming, a Gothic hierarchy of dull gilded gold. Around me the students move with faces frozen in solemn masks, and I seem to hear already the voices mechanically raised in the songs the visitors loved. Loved? Demanded. Sung? An ultimatum accepted and ritualized, an allegiance recited for the peace it imparted, and for that perhaps loved. Loved as the defeated come to love the symbols of their conquerors. A gesture of acceptance, of terms laid down and reluctantly approved, and here, sitting rigid, I remember the evenings spent before the sweeping platform in awe and in pleasure, and in the pleasure of awe, remember the short formal sermons intoned from the pulpit there, rendered in smooth articulate tones, with calm assurance purged of that wild emotion of the crude preachers most of us knew in our hometowns and of whom we were deeply ashamed, these logical appeals which reached us more like the thrust of a firm and formal design requiring nothing more than the lucidity of uncluttered periods, the lulling movement of multisyllabic words to thrill and console us. And I remember, too, the talks of visiting speakers, all eager to inform us of how fortunate we were to be a part of the vast and formal ritual. How fortunate to belong to this family sheltered from those lost in ignorance and darkness. Here upon this stage the black rite of Horatio Alger was performed to God's own acting script, with millionaires come down to portray themselves, not merely acting out the myth of their goodness, and wealth and success and power and benevolence and authority in cardboard masks, but themselves, these virtues concretely. Not the wafer and the wine, but the flesh and the blood, vibrant and alive, and vibrant even when stooped, ancient and withered. And who, in face of this, would not believe? Could even doubt? And I remember too, how we confronted those others, those who had set me here in this Eden, whom we knew though we didn't know, who were unfamiliar in their familiarity, who trailed their words to us through blood and violence and ridicule and condescension with drawling smiles, and who exhorted and threatened, intimidated with innocent words as they described to us the limitations of our lives and the vast boldness of our aspirations, the staggering folly of our impatience to rise even higher, who, as they talked, aroused furtive visions within me of blood froth sparkling their chins like their familiar tobacco juice, and upon their lips the curdled milk of a million black slave mammies withered dugs, a treacherous and fluid knowledge of our being, imbibed at our source and now regurgitated foul upon us. This was our world, they said as they described it to us, this our horizon and its earth, its seasons and its climate, its spring and its summer, and its fall and harvest some unknown millennium ahead, and these its floods and cyclones and they themselves are thunder and lightning, and this we must accept and love and accept even if we did not love. We must accept, even when those were absent, and the men who made the railroads and ships and towers of stone, were before our eyes, in the flesh, their voices different, unweighted with recognizable danger and their delight in our songs more sincere seeming, their regard for our welfare marked by an almost benign and impersonal indifference. But the words of the others were stronger than the strength of philanthropic dollars, deeper than shafts sunk in the earth for oil and gold, more awe-inspiring than the miracles fabricated in scientific laboratories. For their most innocent words were acts of violence to which we of the campus were hypersensitive though we endured them not. And there on the platform I too had stridden and debated, a student leader directing my voice at the highest beams and farthest rafters, ringing them, the accents staccato upon the ridgepole and echoing back with a tinkling, like words hurled to the trees of a wilderness, or into a well of slate-gray water, more sound than sense, a play upon the resonances of buildings, an assault upon the temples of the ear, ha! To the gray-haired matron in the final row. Ha! Miss Susie Gresham, back there looking at that coed smiling at that head, listen to me, the bungling bugler of words, imitating the trumpet and the trombone's timbre, playing thematic variations like a baritone horn. Hey! Old connoisseur of voice sounds, of voices without messages, of newsless winds, listen to the vowel sounds and the crackling dentals, to the low harsh gutturals of empty anguish, now riding the curve of a preacher's rhythm I heard long ago in a Baptist church, stripped now of its imagery, no suns having hemorrhages, no moons weeping tears, no earthworms refusing the sacred flesh and dancing in the earth on Easter morn. Ha! Singing achievement, ha! Booming success, intoning, ha! Acceptance, ha! A river of word sounds filled with drowned passions, floating, ha! With wrecks of unachievable ambitions and stillborn revolts, sweeping their ears, ha! Ranged stiff before me, necks stretched forward with listening ears, ha! A spraying the ceiling and a drumming the dark-stained after, that seasoned cross-arm of torturous timber mellowed in the kiln of 1,000 voices, playing ha! As upon a xylophone, words marching like the student band, up the campus and down again, blaring triumphant sounds empty of triumphs. Hey, Miss Susie! The sound of words that were no words, counterfeit notes singing achievements yet unachieved, riding upon the wings of my voice out to you, old matron, who knew the voice sounds of the founder and knew the accents and echo of his promise, your grey old head cocked with the young around you, your eyes closed, face ecstatic, as I toss the word sounds in my breath, my bellows, my fountain, like bright-colored balls in a water spout. Hear me, old matron, justify now this sound with your dear old nod of affirmation, your closed-eye smile and bow of recognition, who'll never be fooled with the mere content of words, not my words, not these pin-feathered flighters that stroke your lids till they flutter with ecstasy with but the mere echoed noise of the promise. And after the singing and outward marching, you seize my hand and sing out quavering, boy, someday you'll make the founder proud. Ha! Susie Gresham, Mother Gresham, guardian of the hot young women on the Puritan benches who couldn't see your Jordan's water for their private steam, you, relic of slavery whom the campus loved but did not understand, aged, of slavery, yet bearer of something warm and vital and all-enduring, of which in that island of shame we were not ashamed. It was to you on the final row I directed my rush of sound, and it was you of whom I thought with shame and regret as I waited for the ceremony to begin. The honored guests moved silently upon the platform, herded toward their high, carved chairs by Dr. Bledsoe with the decorum of a portly head waiter. Like some of the guests, he wore striped trousers and a swallowtail coat with black braided lapels topped by a rich ascot tie. It was his regular dress for such occasions, yet for all its elegance, he managed to make himself look humble. Somehow, his trousers inevitably bagged at the knees and the coat slouched in the shoulders. I watched him smiling at first one and then another of the guests, of whom all but one were white, and as I saw him placing his hand upon their arms, touching their backs, whispering to a tall angular-faced trustee who in turn touched his arm familiarly, I felt a shudder. I too had touched a white man today and I felt that it had been disastrous, and I realized then that he was the only one of us whom I knew, except perhaps a barber or a nursemaid, who could touch a white man with impunity. And I remembered too that whenever white guests came upon the platform he placed his hand upon them as though exercising a powerful magic. I watched his teeth flash as he took a white hand, then, with all seated, he went to his place at the end of the row of chairs. Several terraces of students' faces above them, the organist, his eyes glinting at the console, was waiting with his head turned over his shoulder, and I saw Dr. Bledsoe, his eyes roaming over the audience, suddenly nod without turning his head. It was as though he had given a downbeat with an invisible baton. The organist turned and hunched his shoulders. A high cascade of sound bubbled from the organ, spreading, thick and clinging, over the chapel, slowly surging. The organist twisted and turned on his bench, with his feet flying beneath him as though dancing to rhythms totally unrelated to the decorous thunder of his organ. And Dr. Bledsoe sat with a benign smile of inward concentration. Yet his eyes were darting swiftly, first over the rows of students, then over the section reserved for teachers, his swift glance carrying a threat for all. For he demanded that everyone attend these sessions. It was here that policy was announced in broadest rhetoric. I seemed to feel his eyes resting upon my face as he swept the section in which I sat. I looked at the guests on the platform. They sat with that alert relaxation with which they always met our upturned eyes. I wondered to which of them I might go to intercede for me with Dr. Bledsoe, but within myself I knew that there was no one. In spite of the array of important men beside him, and despite the posture of humility and meekness which made him seem smaller than the others, although he was physically larger, Dr. Bledsoe made his presence felt by us with a far greater impact. I remembered the legend of how he had come to the college, a barefoot boy who in his fervor for education had trudged with his bundle of ragged clothing across 2 states. And how he was given a job feeding slop to the hogs but had made himself the best slop dispenser in the history of the school, and how the founder had been impressed and made him his office boy. Each of us knew of his rise over years of hard work to the presidency, and each of us at some time wished that he had walked to the school or pushed a wheelbarrow or performed some other act of determination and sacrifice to attest his eagerness for knowledge. I remembered the admiration and fear he inspired in everyone on the campus, the pictures in the Negro press captioned educator, in type that exploded like a rifle shot, his face looking out at you with utmost confidence. To us he was more than just a president of a college. He was a leader, a statesman who carried our problems to those above us, even unto the White House, and in days past he had conducted the president himself about the campus. He was our leader and our magic, who kept the endowment high, the funds for scholarships plentiful and publicity moving through the channels of the press. He was our coal-black daddy of whom we were afraid. As the organ voices died, I saw a thin brown girl arise noiselessly with the rigid control of a modern dancer, high in the upper rows of the choir, and begin to sing a cappella. She began softly, as though singing to herself of emotions of utmost privacy, a sound not addressed to the gathering, but which they overheard almost against her will. Gradually she increased its volume, until at times the voice seemed to become a disembodied force that sought to enter her, to violate her, shaking her, rocking her rhythmically, as though it had become the source of her being, rather than the fluid web of her own creation. I saw the guests on the platform turn to look behind them, to see the thin brown girl in white choir robe standing high against the organ pipes, herself become before our eyes a pipe of contained, controlled and sublimated anguish, a thin plain face transformed by music. I could not understand the words, but only the mood, sorrowful, vague and ethereal, of the singing. It throbbed with nostalgia, regret and repentance, and I sat with a lump in my throat as she sank slowly down, not a sitting but a controlled collapsing, as though she were balancing, sustaining the simmering bubble of her final tone by some delicate rhythm of her heart's blood, or by some mystic concentration of her being, focused upon the sound through the contained liquid of her large uplifted eyes. There was no applause, only the appreciation of a profound silence. The white guests exchanged smiles of approval. I sat thinking of the dread possibility of having to leave all this, of being expelled, imagining the return home and the rebukes of my parents. I looked out at the scene now from far back in my despair, seeing the platform and its actors as through a reversed telescope, small doll-like figures moving through some meaningless ritual. Someone up there, above the alternating moss-dry and grease-slick heads of the students rode before me, was making announcements from a lectern on which a dim light shone. Another figure rose and led a prayer. Someone spoke. Then around me everyone was singing lead me to a rock that is higher than I, and as though the sound contained some force more imperious than the image of the scene of which it was the living connective tissue, I was pulled back to its immediacy. One of the guests had risen to speak. A man of striking ugliness, fat, with a bullet head set on a short neck, with a nose much too wide for its face, upon which he wore black-lensed glasses. He had been seated next to Dr. Bledsoe, but so concerned had I been with the president that I hadn't really seen him. My eyes had focused only upon the white men and Dr. Bledsoe. So that now as he arose and crossed slowly to the center of the platform, I had the notion that part of Dr. Bledsoe had arisen and moved forward, leaving his other part smiling in the chair. He stood before us relaxed, his white collar gleaming like a band between his black face and his dark garments, dividing his head from his body, his short arms crossed before his barrel, like a black little Buddha's. For a moment he stood with his large head lifted, as though thinking, then he began speaking, his voice round and vibrant as he told of his pleasure in being allowed to visit the school once more after many years. Having been preaching in a northern city, he had seen it last in the final days of the founder, when Dr. Bledsoe was the second in command. Those were wonderful days, he droned. Significant days. Days filled with great portent. As he talked he made a cage of his hands by touching his fingertips, then with his small feet pressing together, he began a slow, rhythmic rocking, tilting forward on his toes until it seemed he would fall, then back on his heels, the lights catching his black lensed glasses until it seemed that his head floated free of his body and was held close to it only by the white band of his collar. And as he tilted he talked until a rhythm was established. Then he was renewing the dream in our hearts. This barren land after emancipation, he intoned, this land of darkness and sorrow, of ignorance and degradation, where the hand of brother had been turned against brother, father against son, and son against father, where master had turned against slave and slave against master, where all was strife and darkness, an aching land. And into this land came a humble prophet, lowly like the humble carpenter of Nazareth, a slave and a son of slaves, knowing only his mother. A slave born, but marked from the beginning by a high intelligence and princely personality, born in the lowest part of this barren, war-scarred land, yet somehow shedding light upon it where'er he passed through. I'm sure you have heard of his precarious infancy, his precious life almost destroyed by an insane cousin who splashed the babe with lye and shriveled his seed, and how, a mere babe, he lay 9 days in a death-like coma and then suddenly and miraculously recovered. You might say that it was as though he had risen from the dead or been reborn. Oh, my young friends, he cried, beaming, my young friends, it is indeed a beautiful story. I'm sure you've heard it many times. Recall how he came upon his initial learning through shrewd questioning of his little masters, the elder masters never suspecting, and how he learned his alphabet and taught himself to read and solve the secret of words, going instinctively to the Holy Bible with its great wisdom for his first knowledge. And you know how he escaped and made his way across mountain and valley to that place of learning, and how he persisted and worked noontimes, nights and mornings for the privilege of studying, or, as the old folk would say, of rubbing his head against a college wall. You know of his brilliant career, how already he was a moving orator, then his penniless graduation and his return after years to this country. And then his great struggle beginning. Picture it, my young friends, the clouds of darkness all over the land, black folk and white folk full of fear and hate, wanting to go forward, but each fearful of the other. A whole region is caught in a terrible tension. Everyone is perplexed with the question of what must be done to dissolve this fear and hatred that crouched over the land like a demon waiting to spring, and you know how he came and showed them the way. Oh, yes, my friends, I'm sure you've heard it time and time again, of this godly man's labors, his great humility and his undimming vision, the fruits of which you enjoy today, concrete, made flesh, his dream, conceived in the starkness and darkness of slavery, fulfilled now even in the air you breathe, in the sweet harmonies of your blended voices, in the knowledge which each of you, daughters and granddaughters, sons and grandsons, of slaves, all of you partaking of it in bright and well-equipped classrooms. You must see this slave, this black Aristotle, moving slowly, with sweet patience, with a patience not of mere man, but of God-inspired faith. See him moving slowly as he surmounts each and every opposition. Rendering unto Caesar that which was Caesar's, yes, but steadfastly seeking for you that bright horizon which you now enjoy. All this, he said, spreading his fingers palm down before him, has been told and retold throughout the land, inspiring a humble but fast-rising people. You have heard it, and it, this true story of rich implication, this living parable of proven glory and humble nobility, and it, as I say, has made you free. Even you who have come to this shrine only this semester know it. You have heard his name from your parents, for it was he who led them to the path, guiding them like a great captain, like that great pilot of ancient times who led his people safe and unharmed across the bottom of the blood-red sea. And your parents followed this remarkable man across the black sea of prejudice, safely out of the land of ignorance, through the storms of fear and anger, shouting, "Let my people go!" when it was necessary, whispering it during those times when whispering was wisest. And he was heard. I listened, my back pressing against the hard bench, with a numbness, my emotions woven into his words as upon a loom. And remember how, he said, when he entered a certain state at cotton-picking time, his enemies had plotted to take his life. And recall how during his journey he was stopped by the strange figure of a man whose pitted features revealed no inkling of whether he was black or white. Some say he was a Greek, some a Mongolian, others a mulatto, and others still, a simple white man of God. Whoever, and whatsoever, and we must not rule out the possibility of an emissary direct from above, oh, yes, and remember how he appeared suddenly, startling both founder and horse as he gave warning, telling the founder to leave the horse and buggy there in the road and proceed immediately to a certain cabin, then slipped silently away, so silently, my young friends, that the founder doubted his very existence. And you know how the great man continued through the dusk, determined though puzzled as he approached the town. He was lost in reverie until the crack of the first rifle sounded, then the almost fatal volley that creased his skull, oh my, and left him stunned and apparently lifeless. I have heard him tell with his own lips how consciousness returned while they were still upon him examining their foul deed, and how he lay biting his heart lest they hear it and wipe out their failure with a coup de grace, as the French would say. Ha! And I'm sure you've each of you lived with him through his escape, he said, seeming to look directly into my watered eyes. You awakened when he awakened, rejoiced when he rejoiced at their leaving without further harm, arising when he arose, seeing with his eyes the prints of their milling footsteps and the cartridges dropped in the dust about the imprint of his fallen body, yes, and the cold, dust-encrusted, but not quite fatal blood. And you hurried with him full of doubt to the cabin designated by the stranger, where he met that seemingly demented black man. You remember that old one, laughed at by the children in the town's square, old, comic-faced, crafty, cotton-headed. And yet it was he who bound up your wounds with the wounds of the founder. He, the old slave, showing a surprising knowledge of such matters, germology and scabology, ha! Ha, he called it, and what a youthful skill of the hands! For he shaved our skull, and cleansed our wound and bound it neat with bandages stolen from the home of an unsuspecting leader of the mob, ha! And you recall how you plunged with the founder, the leader, deep into the black art of escape, guided at first, indeed, initiated, by the seemingly demented one who had learned his craft in slavery. You left with the founder in the black of night, and I know it. You hurried silently along the river bottom, stung by mosquitoes, hooted by owls, zoomed by bats, buzzed by snakes that rattled among the rocks, mud and fever, darkness and sighing. You hid all the following day in the cabin where 13 slept in 3 small rooms, standing until darkness in the fireplace chimney, back in all the soot and ashes, ha! Ha! Guarded by the granny who dozed at the hearth seemingly without a fire. You stood in the blackness, and when they came with their baying hounds they thought her demented. But she knew, she knew. She knew the fire. She knew the fire. She knew the fire that burned without consuming. My God, yes. My God, yes. A woman's voice responded, adding to the structure of his vision within me. And you left with him in the morning, hidden in a wagon load of cotton, in the very center of the fleece, where you breathed the hot air through the barrel of the emergency shotgun, the cartridges, which thank God it was unnecessary to use, held fanwise and ready between the spread fingers of your hand. And you went into this town with him and were hidden by the friendly aristocrat one night, and on the next by the white blacksmith who held no hatred, surprising contradictions of the underground. Escaping, yes. Helped by those who knew you and those who didn't know. Because for some it was enough to see him, others helped without even that, black and white. But mostly it was our own who aided, because you were their own and we have always helped our own. And so, my young friends, my sisters and brothers, you went with him, in and out of cabins, by night and early morning, through swamps and hills. On and on, passed from black hand to black hand and some white hands, and all the hands molding the founder's freedom and our own freedom like voices shaping a deep-felt song. And you, each of you, were with him. Ah, how well you know it, for it was you who escaped to freedom. Ah, yes, and you know the story. I saw him resting now, and beaming out across the chapel, his huge head turning to all its corners like a beacon, his voice still echoing as I fought back my emotion. For the first time the evocation of the founder saddened me, and the campus seemed to rush past me, fast retreating, like the fading of a dream at the sundering of slumber. Beside me, the student's eyes swam with a distorting cataract of tears, his features rigid as though he struggled within himself. The fat man was playing upon the whole audience without the least show of exertion. He seemed completely composed, hidden behind his black-lensed glasses, only his mobile features gesturing his vocal drama. I nudged the boy beside me. "Who is he?" I whispered. He gave me a look of annoyance, almost of outrage. "Reverend Homer A. Barbee, Chicago," he said. Now the speaker rested his arm upon the lectern and turned toward Dr. Bledsoe. "You've heard the bright beginning of the beautiful story, my friends. But there is the mournful ending, and perhaps in many ways the richer side. The setting of this glorious sun of the morning." He turned to Dr. Bledsoe. "It was a fateful day, Dr. Bledsoe, sir, if I may recall it to you, for we were there." "Oh yes, my young friends," he said, turning to face us again with a sad proud smile. "I knew him well and loved him, and I was there. We had toured through several states to which he was carrying the message. The people had come to hear the prophet, the multitude had responded. The old-fashioned people, women in aprons and Mother Hubbards of calico and gingham, men in their overalls and patched alpacas, a sea of upturned and puzzled faces looking out from beneath old battered straw hats and limp sunbonnets. They who had come by oxen and mule team and by walking long distances. It was the month of September and unseasonably cold. He had spoken peace and confidence into their troubled souls, had set a star before them, and we were passing on to other scenes, still carrying the message. Ah, those days of ceaseless travel, those youthful days, those springtime days, fertile, blossomy, sun-filled days of promise. Ah, yes, those indescribably glorious days, in which the founder was building the dream not only here in this thin barren valley, but hither and yonder throughout the land, instilling the dream in the hearts of the people. Erecting the scaffolding of a nation. Broadcasting his message that fell like seed on tallow ground, sacrificing himself, fighting and forgiving his enemies of both complexions. Oh yes, he had them, of both complexions. But going forward filled with the importance of his message, filled with his dedicated mission, and in his zeal, perhaps in his mortal pride, ignoring the advice of his physician. I see in my mind's eye the fatal atmosphere of that jam-packed auditorium. The founder holds the audience within the gentle palm of his eloquence, rocking it, soothing it, instructing it, and there below, the rapt faces blushed by the glow of the big pot-bellied stove now turned cherry red with its glowing, yes, the spellbound rose caught in the imperious truth of his message. And I hear now, again, the great humming hush as his voice reached the end of a mighty period, and one of the listeners, a snowy-headed man, leaps to his feet crying out, "Tell us what is to be done, sir. For God's sake, tell us. Tell us in the name of the son they snatched from me last week." And all through the room the voices are rising, imploring, "Tell us, tell us." and the founder is suddenly mute with tears. Old Barbie's voice rang out, as suddenly he made charged and incomplete movements about the platform, acting out his words. And I watched with a sick fascination, knowing part of the story, yet a part of me fighting against its sad inevitable conclusion. And the founder pauses, then steps forward with his eyes spilling his great emotion. With his arm upraised, he begins to answer and totters. Then all is commotion. We rush forward and lead him away. The audience leaps to its feet in consternation. All is terror and turmoil, a moan and a sighing. Until, like a clap of thunder, I hear Dr. Bledsoe's voice ring out whip-like with authority, a song of hope. And as we stretch the founder upon a bench to rest, I hear Dr. Bledsoe stomping out the time with mighty strokes upon the hollow platform, commanding not in words but in the great gut tones of his magnificent basso. Oh, but wasn't he a singer? Isn't he a singer still today? And they stand, they come, and with him they sing out against the tottering of their giant. Sing out their long black songs of blood and bones, meaning hope. Of hardship and pain, meaning faith. Of humbleness and absurdity, meaning endurance. Of ceaseless struggle in darkness, meaning triumph. Ha! Barbie cried, slapping his hands, ha! Singing verse after verse, until the leader revived. Slap, slap of his hands, addressed them, slap, my God, assured them, slap, that, slap, he was only tired of his ceaseless efforts. Slap, yes, and dismisses them, sending each on his way rejoicing, giving each a parting handshake of fellowship. I watched Barbie pace in a semicircle, his lips compressed, his face working with emotion, his palms meeting but making no sound. Ah, those days in which he tilled his mighty fields, those days in which he watched the crops take hold and grow, those youthful, summery, sun-bright days. Barbie's voice sighed off in nostalgia. The chapel hardly breathed as he sighed deeply. Then I watched him produce a snowy handkerchief, remove his dark glasses and wipe his eyes, and through the increasing distance of my isolation, I watched the men in the seats of honor slowly shake their spellbound heads. Then Barbie's voice began again, disembodied now, and it was as though he had never paused, as though his words, reverberating within us, had continued their rhythmic flow though their source was for a moment stilled. Oh, yes, my young friends, oh, yes, he continued with a great sadness. Man's hope can paint a purple picture, can transform a soaring vulture into a noble eagle or a moaning dove. Oh, yes. But I knew, he shouted, startling me. In spite of that great, anguished hope within me, I knew that the Great Spirit was declining, was approaching its lonely winter, the great sun going down. For sometimes it is given one to know these things. And I staggered under the awful burden of that knowledge and I cursed myself because I bore it. But such was the founder's enthusiasm, oh, yes, that as we sped from country town to country town through the glorious Indian summer, I soon forgot. And then, I listened to his voice fall to a whisper, his hands were outspread as though he were leading an orchestra into a profound and final diminuendo. Then his voice rose again, crisply, almost matter-of-factly, accelerated. I remember the start of the train, how it seemed to groan as it started up the steep grade into the mountain. It was cold. Frost formed its icy patterns upon the window's edges. And the whistle of the train was long-drawn and lonely, a sigh issuing from the depths of the mountain. In the car up ahead, in the Pullman assigned him by the very president of the line, the leader lay tossing. He had been struck with a sudden and mysterious sickness. And I knew in spite of the anguish within me that the sun goeth down, for the heavens themselves conveyed that knowledge. The rush of the train, the clicking of wheels upon the steel. I remember how I looked out of the frosted pane and saw the looming great North Star and lost it, as though the sky had shut its eye. The train was curving the mountain, the engine loping like a great black hound, parallel with the last careening cars, panting forth its pale white vapor as it hurled us ever higher. And shortly the sky was black, without a moon. As his muon echoed over the chapel, he drew his chin against his chest until his white collar disappeared, leaving him a figure of balanced unbroken blackness, and I could hear the rasp of air as he inhaled. It was as though the very constellations knew our impending sorrow. He bugled, his head raised to the ceiling, his voice full-throated. For against that great, wide sweep of sable there came the burst of a single jewel-like star, and I saw it shimmer, and break, and streak down the cheek of that coal-black sky like a reluctant and solitary tear. He shook his head with great emotion, his lips pursed as he moaned, turning toward Dr. Bledsoe as though he did not quite see him. At that fateful moment, I sat with your great president. He was deep in meditation as we awaited word from the men of science, and he said to me of that dying star, Barbie, friend, did you see? And I answered, yes, doctor, I saw. And at our throats already we felt the cold hands of sorrow. And I said to Dr. Bledsoe, let us pray. And as we knelt there on the swaying floor our words were less prayers than sounds of mute and terrible sorrow. And it was then, as we pulled to our feet, staggering with the motion of that speeding train, that we saw the physician moving toward us. And we looked with bated breath into the blank and expressionless features of the man of science, asking with our total beings, do you bring us hope or disaster? And it was then and there he informed us that the leader was nearing his destination. It was said, the cruel blow had fallen and we were left numb, but the founder was still for the moment with us and still in command. And, of all in the traveling party, he sent for him who sits there before you, and for me as a man of God. But he wanted mainly his friend of midnight consultations, his comrade of many battles, who over the weary years had remained steadfast in defeat as in victory. Even now I can see it, the dark passage lit with dim lights and Dr. Bledsoe swaying as he went before me. At the door stood the porter and the conductor, a black man and a white man of the South, both crying, both weeping. And he looked up as we entered, his great eyes resigned but still aflame with nobility and courage against the white of his pillow, and he looked at his friend and smiled. Smiled warmly at his old campaigner, his loyal champion, his adjunct, that marvelous singer of the old songs who had rallied his spirit during times of distress and discouragement, who with his singing of the old familiar melodies soothed the doubts and fears of the multitude, he who had rallied the ignorant, the fearful and suspicious, those still wrapped in the rags of slavery, him, there, your leader, who calmed the children of the storm. And as the founder looked up at his companion, he smiled. And reaching out his hand to his friend and companion as I now stretch out my hand to you, he said, come closer. Come closer. And he moved closer, until he stood beside the berth, and the light slanting across his shoulder as he knelt beside him. And the hand reached out and gently touched him and he said, now, you must take on the burden. Lead them the rest of the way. And oh, the cry of that train and the pain too big for tears. When the train reached the summit of the mountain, he was no longer with us. And as the train dropped down the grade he had departed. It had become a veritable train of sorrow. Dr. Bledsoe there, sat weary in mind and heavy of heart. What should he do? The leader was dead and he thrown suddenly at the head of the troops like a cavalryman catapulted into the saddle of his general felled in a charge of battle vaulted onto the back of his fiery and half-broken charger. Ah! And that great, black, noble beast, wall-eyed with the din of battle and twitching already with its sense of loss. What command should he give? Should he return with his burden home, to where already the hot wires were flashing, speaking, rattling the mournful message? Should he turn and bear the fallen soldier down the cold and alien mountain to this valley home? Return with the dear eyes dulled, the firm hand still, the magnificent voice silent, the leader cold? Return to the warm valley, to the green grounds he could no longer light with his mortal vision? Should he follow his leader's vision though he had now himself departed? Ah, of course you know the story. How he bore the body into the strange city, and the speech he made as his leader lay in state, and how when the sad news spread, a day of mourning was declared for the whole municipality. Oh, and how rich and poor, black and white, weak and powerful, young and old, all came to pay their homage, many realizing the leader's worth and their loss only now with his passing. And how, with his mission done, Dr. Bledsoe returned, keeping his sorrowful vigil with his friend in an humble baggage car, and how the people came to pay their respects at the stations. A slow train. A sorrowful train. And all along the line, in mountain and valley, wherever the rails found their fateful course, the people were one in their common mourning, and like the cold steel rails, were spiked down to their sorrow. Oh, what a sad departure! And what an even sadder arrival! See with me, my young friends, hear with me, the weeping and wailing of those who shared his labors. Their sweet leader returned to them, rock cold in the iron immobility of death. He who had left them quick, in the prime of his manhood, author of their own fire and illumination, returned to them cold, already a bronzed statue. Oh, the despair, my young friends! The black despair of black people. I see them now, wandering about these grounds, where each brick, each bird, each blade of grass was a reminder of some precious memory, and each memory a hammer stroke driving home the blunt spikes of their sorrow. Oh, yes, some now are here gray-haired among you, still dedicated to his vision, still laboring in the vineyard, but then with the black-draped coffin lying in state among them, inescapably reminding them, they felt the dark night of slavery settling once more upon them. They smelt that old obscene stink of darkness, that old slavery smell, worse than the rank halitosis of hoary death. Their sweet light enclosed in a black-draped coffin, their majestic sun snatched behind a cloud. Oh, and the sad sound of weeping bugles. I can hear them now, stationed at the four corners of the campus, sounding taps for the fallen general, announcing and re-announcing the sad tidings, telling and retelling the sad revelation one to the other across the still numbness of the air, as though they could not believe it, could neither comprehend nor accept it, bugles weeping like a family of tender women lamenting their loved one. And the people came to sing the old songs and to express their unspeakable sorrow. Black, black, black. Black people in blacker mourning, the funeral crape hung upon their naked hearts, singing unashamedly their black folk songs of sorrow, moving painfully, overflowing the curving walks, weeping and wailing beneath the drooping trees, and their low murmuring voices like the moans of winds in a wilderness. And finally they gathered on the hill slope, and as far as the tear-wet eyes could see, they stood with their heads bowed, singing. Then silence. The lonesome hole banked with poignant flowers. The dozen white-gloved hands waiting taut upon the silken ropes. That awful silence. The final words are spoken. A single wild rose-tossed farewell, bursts slowly, its petals drifting snow-like upon the reluctantly lowered coffin. Then down into the earth, back to the ancient dust, back to the cold black clay. Mother of us all. As Barbie paused, the silence was so complete that I could hear the power engines far across the campus throbbing the night like an excited pulse. Somewhere in the audience an old woman's voice began a plaintive wail, the birth of a sad, untremulated song that died stillborn in a sob. Barbie stood with his head thrown back, his arms rigid at his sides, his fists clenched as though fighting desperately for control. Dr. Bledsoe sat with his face in his hands. Near me someone blew his nose. Barbie took a tottering step forward. "Oh, yes. Oh, yes," he said. "Oh, yes. That too is part of the glorious story. But think of it not as a death, but as a birth. A great seed had been planted. A seed which has continued to put forth its fruit in its season as surely as if the great Creator had been resurrected. For in a sense he was, if not in the flesh, in the spirit. And in a sense in the flesh too. For has not your present leader become his living agent, his physical presence? Look about you if you doubt it. My young friends, my dear young friends. How can I tell you what manner of man this is who leads you? How can I convey to you how well he has kept his pledge to the founder, how conscientious has been his stewardship? First, you must see the school as it was. Already a great institution, to be sure, but then the buildings were 8, now they are 20, then the faculty was 50, now it is 200, then the student body was a few hundred, where now I'm told you are 3,000. And now where you have roads of asphalt for the passage of rubber tires, then the roads were of crushed stone for the passage of oxen, and mule teams, and horse-drawn wagons. I have not the words to tell you how my heart swelled to return to this great institution after so great a while, to move among its wealth of green things, its fruitful farmland and fragrant campus. Ah! And the marvelous plants supplying power to an area larger than many towns, all operated by black hands. Thus, my young friends, does the light of the founder still burn. Your leader has kept his promise 1,000-fold. I commend him in his own right, for he is the co-architect of a great and noble experiment. He is a worthy successor to his great friend, and it is no accident that his great and intelligent leadership has made him our leading statesman. This is a form of greatness worthy of your imitation. I say to you, pattern yourselves upon him. Aspire, each of you, to someday follow in his footsteps. Great deeds are yet to be performed. For we are a young, though a fast-rising, people. Legends are still to be created. Be not afraid to undertake the burdens of your leader, and the work of the founder will be one of ever-unfolding glory, the history of the race a saga of mounting triumphs. Barbie stood with his arms outstretched now, beaming over the audience, his Buddha-like body still as a onyx boulder. There was sniffling throughout the chapel. Voices murmured with admiration, and I felt more lost than ever. For a few minutes old Barbie had made me see the vision, and now I knew that leaving the campus would be like the parting of flesh. I watched him lower his arms now and start back to his chair, moving slowly with his head cocked as though listening to distant music. I had lowered my head to wipe my eyes when I heard the shocked gasp arise. Looking up, I saw 2 of the white trustees moving swiftly across the platform to where Barbie floundered upon Dr. Bledsoe's legs. The old man slid forward upon his hands and knees as the 2 white men took his arms, and now as he stood I saw one of them reach for something on the floor and place it in his hands. It was when he raised his head that I saw it. For a swift instant, between the gesture and the opaque glitter of his glasses, I saw the blinking of sightless eyes. Homer Barbie was blind. Uttering apologies, Dr. Bledsoe helped him to his chair. Then as the old man rested back with a smile, Dr. Bledsoe walked to the edge of the platform and lifted his arms. I closed my eyes as I heard the deep moaning sound that issued from him, and the rising crescendo of the student body joining in. This time it was music sincerely felt, not rendered for the guests, but for themselves, a song of hope and exaltation. I wanted to rush from the building, but didn't dare. I sat stiff and erect, supported by the hard bench, relying upon it as upon a form of hope. I could not look at Dr. Bledsoe now, because old Barbie had made me both feel my guilt and accept it. For although I had not intended it, any act that endangered the continuity of the dream was an act of treason. I did not listen to the next speaker, a tall white man who kept dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief and repeating his phrases in an emotional and inarticulate manner. Then the orchestra played excerpts from Dvorak's New World Symphony, and I kept hearing Swing Low Sweet Chariot resounding through its dominant theme, my mother's and grandfather's favorite spiritual. It was more than I could stand, and before the next speaker could begin I hurried past the disapproving eyes of teachers and matrons, out into the night. A mockingbird trilled a note from where it perched upon the hand of the moonlit founder, flipping its moon-mad tail above the head of the eternally kneeling slave. I went up the shadowy drive, heard it trill behind me. The street lamps glowed brilliant in the moonlit dream of the campus, each light serene in its cage of shadows. I might well have waited until the end of the services, for I hadn't gone far when I heard the dim, bright notes of the orchestra striking up a march, followed by a burst of voices as the students filed out into the night. With a feeling of dread I headed for the administration building, and upon reaching it, stood in the darkened doorway. My mind fluttered like the moths that veiled the street lamp which cast shadows upon the bank of grass below me. I would now have my real interview with Dr. Bledsoe, And I recalled Barbie's address with resentment. With such words fresh in his mind, I was sure Dr. Bledsoe would be far less sympathetic to my plea. I stood in that darkened doorway trying to probe my future if I were expelled. Where would I go? What would I do? How could I ever return home?